In the year 1096, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 people left everything behind. Their farms, their families, their entire lives, and they started walking toward a city most of them had never seen, across lands they couldn't name, through territories controlled by people who wanted them dead. The thing that almost nobody talks about when they tell you the story of the Crusades is this: the battles were not the hard part. The marching was not the hard part. The hard part, the thing that decided who lived and who died long before any sword was drawn, was money. It was grain. It was the price of a horseshoe nail in a market 3,000 miles from home. The Crusades were not just a religious war. They were one of the most staggering logistical undertakings in human history, and the economics behind them reveal something about faith, ambition, and desperation that no battlefield chronicle ever could. What you are about to hear is the financial story hiding beneath the armor, and by the end, a document you learned about in grade school, a Renaissance painting you have seen 100 times, and the modern banking system you use every single day will all trace back to the same bloody, desperate, money-starved holy war. Most people imagine the Crusaders as a unified army marching under a single banner, but that picture could not be further from the truth. There was no central command structure. There was no war department. There was no treasury issuing paychecks. Every lord, every knight, every foot soldier had to finance his own journey, and the costs were absolutely crushing. Historians estimate that a knight preparing for the First Crusade needed to raise roughly 4 to 5 times his annual income just to cover the basics: armor, weapons, horses, food for the journey, and enough silver to buy supplies along the way. Think about that for a moment. Imagine someone telling you today that in order to fulfill your deepest moral obligation, you need to come up with 4 to 5 years of your salary in cash, give up your job, leave your family with no guaranteed return date, and walk into a war zone on the other side of the world. That is exactly what tens of thousands of people did. And the way they raised that money tells us everything about the medieval economy and the extraordinary power of belief. If this is the kind of history that makes you rethink what you thought you knew, subscribe now, because this is only the surface. So how did a knight in 11th century France come up with 5 years of income on short notice? He sold everything. He mortgaged his land. He pledged his future harvests. He borrowed from monasteries at interest rates that would make a modern credit card company blush. In many cases, he sold hereditary rights his family had held for generations: rights to collect tolls on bridges, rights to mill grain at local mills, rights to fish certain rivers and hunt in certain forests. These were not abstract financial instruments. These were the things that kept his family fed, and he liquidated them for coins he could carry in a saddlebag. The church had promised that Crusaders' property would be protected in their absence, and that debts could be deferred. But enforcement was spotty at best. Many families returned from the Crusades to find their land seized by opportunistic neighbors, their debtors vanished, and their financial lives in ruins. And those were the knights, the wealthy. Now consider what it cost the people who never volunteered for anything. Special crusading taxes were levied on entire kingdoms. The Saladin Tithe of 1188, imposed to fund the Third Crusade after Saladin's capture of Jerusalem, required every person in England to surrender 10% of their income and movable property to the crown. For wealthy merchants and major landowners, this was painful but survivable. For subsistence farmers living on the edge of starvation, it was devastating. Families sold livestock, essential farming tools, and precious seed grain to meet the assessment, undermining their ability to produce food the following year and setting off cascading cycles of poverty and hunger. Some could not pay and lost what little they had to royal collectors backed by armed men. The resentment this generated was not abstract. It was deep, personal, and it accumulated over decades. In England specifically, fury over excessive royal taxation, including but not limited to taxes linked to crusading ventures, was one of the core grievances that eventually forced King John to accept the Magna Carta in 1215, one of the foundational documents of constitutional governance in the English-speaking world. The financial demands of the Crusades were not theoretical. They were felt in every village market, every peasant household, and every parish church across Western Europe. But raising the money was just step one. What happened when that money had to keep an army alive across 3,000 miles of hostile territory? That is where the real nightmare began. Consider the sheer scale of what needed to move. A single soldier needs roughly 2 to 3 pounds of grain per day just to stay functional. Multiply that by 50,000, and you are looking at around 75 tons of grain consumed every single day. And that does not begin to account for the horses. A warhorse eats roughly 20 pounds of grain and 20 pounds of fodder daily, each one consuming more than 6 men. The total daily caloric requirement for the crusading force, including pack animals, draft animals, and war horses, was almost incomprehensible by medieval logistic standards. No supply chain on Earth in 1096 was designed to handle that kind of volume over that kind of distance, and the Crusaders knew it. Their plan, such as it was, amounted to this: live off the land, buy what you can at local markets, and pray that God provides. Through friendly Christian territory in Hungary and the Byzantine Empire, where functioning markets existed and local rulers had been forewarned, that plan held together. But the moment the Crusaders crossed into Anatolia, into territory controlled by the Seljuk Turks, everything fell apart. Markets vanished. Friendly supply lines did not exist. Foraging became a desperate euphemism for armed raiding. And then the army reached Antioch, and what happened there is one of the most horrifying logistics failures in recorded military history. The siege of Antioch lasted 8 months, from October 1097 to June 1098, and the besieging army had barely brought enough food for 8 weeks. Within months, the Crusaders were starving worse than the city inside the walls. Famine prices took hold immediately, a single loaf of bread selling for what would have bought an entire cart of grain back in France. Horses were slaughtered for their meat, which meant knights lost the mounted charge, the one tactical advantage that made European heavy cavalry the most feared fighting force in the medieval world. Men boiled leather straps, belts, and shield covers for whatever nutrition could be extracted from animal hide. Multiple independent contemporary sources document instances of cannibalism among the starving soldiers. The army that was supposed to be liberating the Holy Land in the name of Christ was eating itself alive, because nobody had solved the fundamental supply problem. That single sentence, "nobody had solved the supply problem," is the sentence that explains more about the Crusades than any chronicle of battlefield heroics ever written. And here is where the story pivots, because the Crusaders did something remarkable. They learned. Not immediately, not without enormous suffering, but they learned, and the financial and logistical systems they built in response would reshape the economy of the entire Western world. What they created to keep themselves alive became the foundation of modern banking. And the organization at the center of that transformation is one you have heard of, though probably not for the right reasons. After the First Crusade succeeded and the Crusader states were established along the coast, a permanent logistical problem demanded permanent financial solutions. How do you maintain European-style kingdoms 3,000 miles from Europe, surrounded by hostile powers, with a tiny settler population that needs constant reinforcement and resupply? The answer that evolved was one of the most sophisticated financial networks the medieval world had ever seen. And at its center sat the Knights Templar. People love to talk about the Templars in terms of conspiracy theories and hidden treasure, but the real story is a financial story, and it is far more interesting than any conspiracy could be. The Templars began as 9 knights protecting Christian pilgrims on the dangerous road between Jaffa and Jerusalem, and they quickly identified the single greatest threat to those pilgrims: not bandits, but the fundamental problem of carrying large amounts of money across thousands of miles of lawless territory. A pilgrim from Paris carrying enough silver for his entire journey was a walking target. So the Templars invented something that sounds almost impossibly modern. A pilgrim could deposit his money at a Templar commandery in Paris, receive a coded letter of credit, and withdraw equivalent funds at a Templar house in Acre or Jerusalem, minus a small fee. Consider a man named Roger, a minor French landowner who sold half his timber rights to fund his pilgrimage in 1180. In any previous decade, Roger would have sewn silver coins into the lining of his cloak, and prayed he was not robbed or murdered between Marseille and the Holy Land. Instead, Roger walked into a Templar house in Paris, handed over his coins, received a document bearing encrypted marks that only another Templar could authenticate, and traveled nearly empty-handed across the Mediterranean. When he arrived in Acre, he presented his letter and received local currency sufficient to cover his expenses. The Templars could not call this banking. The Church explicitly prohibited Christians from charging interest on loans, condemning it as the sin of usury. But the service fees, currency exchange margins, and various financial workarounds they developed generated enormous revenue, and that revenue made the Templars extraordinarily wealthy and powerful. Remember this wealth. Remember what it attracted. Because later in the story, a king is going to look at the Templar treasury and decide that destroying an entire religious order is easier than repaying what he owes them. The Templars were only one piece of a larger puzzle. The Italian merchant republics Venice, Genoa, and Pisa had provided critical naval support during the early Crusades, and they extracted their payment not in gold, but in permanent trading privileges. Venice negotiated entire autonomous quarters within Crusader city zones where Venetian law applied, Venetian taxes were collected, and Venetian merchants operated as a sovereign commercial entity embedded within a foreign kingdom. This was the calculated price of logistics. Without Venetian ships, the Crusader states could not receive the reinforcements and supplies they needed to survive. The Venetians understood their leverage perfectly, and they wielded it to build a commercial empire that would dominate Mediterranean trade for 3 centuries. But the moment that most perfectly demonstrates how finance hijacked faith, the moment where money did not just influence a crusade, but completely redirected one, had not happened yet. And when it did, it produced the single most consequential financial disaster of the entire medieval period. In 1202, the Fourth Crusade assembled in Venice. The plan was simple. Venice would build a fleet to carry 33,500 men to Egypt. The price was 85,000 silver marks. When the time came to pay, the Crusaders had raised only 51,000. They were short by roughly 40%. Venice had spent nearly 2 years building this fleet, diverting its entire shipbuilding industry away from profitable commerce. The elderly Doge, Enrico Dandolo, over 80 years old, and nearly blind, was not about to absorb that loss. He offered a proposition: help Venice recapture the city of Zara, a rebel Dalmatian port, and the debt would be deferred. The Pope explicitly forbade the attack. Zara was a Christian city under the protection of a Christian king. The Crusaders attacked it anyway, because they were stranded, starving on the Venetian lagoon, and the fleet was their only way forward to any destination. Zara fell in November 1202. The Pope excommunicated the entire army. And then, the financial spiral accelerated, because a claimant to the Byzantine throne appeared in camp, promising 200,000 silver marks and 10,000 soldiers if the army would help him seize Constantinople. For a broke, excommunicated army with nowhere else to go, it was impossible to refuse. Constantinople, the richest city in the Christian world, fell in April 1204, and instead of pressing on to the Holy Land, the Crusaders looted the city with a thoroughness that horrified their own contemporaries. Gold, silver, sacred relics, silks, centuries of accumulated treasure stripped from churches and palaces, loaded onto Venetian ships, and sent west. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. It was hijacked by unpaid debts and consumed by greed. And here is the line that connects this catastrophe to a world you recognize. The enormous flow of plundered wealth that poured into Venice from the sack of Constantinople helped capitalize the commercial revolution that gave rise to the Italian Renaissance. There is a direct, traceable financial line from the fall of Constantinople in 1204 to the paintings of Botticelli and the dome of Brunelleschi, and that line runs through the ledger books of merchants who converted a holy war into the greatest business opportunity of the medieval age. The later Crusades continued to push financial innovation forward. Louis IX of France launched the Seventh Crusade in 1248, and he did everything right. He spent years planning. He levied special taxes. He negotiated credit with Italian banking houses. He stockpiled grain on Cyprus. He built an entire port city, Aigues Mortes, on the French Mediterranean coast specifically for embarkation. The level of advanced planning was extraordinary, and it did not matter. Louis was captured in Egypt along with much of his army, and his ransom was set at 400,000 livres, roughly one-third of France's entire annual royal income. The ransom was paid, partially from the war chest Louis had brought and partially from emergency loans negotiated by his wife, Queen Marguerite, who was holding the Crusader position in Acre at the time. Marguerite conducted high-stakes financial negotiations with Italian bankers while recovering from having given birth just days before, securing the funds that kept the crusading enterprise from total collapse. The institutional resilience required to absorb a blow of that magnitude and continue functioning tells you something profound. By the mid-13th century, the crusading financial infrastructure was no longer a series of improvised solutions. It was a deeply embedded system with contingency plans, established credit lines, and generations of accumulated expertise. And that system, even after the military campaigns ended, did not disappear. It evolved. The Crusades created urgent, practical demand for financial tools that had not existed in Western Europe before 1096. The need to transfer money across enormous distances produced bills of exchange and letters of credit. The need to fund massive expeditions on borrowed capital produced increasingly sophisticated lending networks. The need to manage risk across multiple currencies and legal systems produced accounting innovations that would evolve into double-entry bookkeeping, the foundation of all modern accounting. The great Italian banking families that dominated the 13th and 14th centuries, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, and ultimately the Medici, built their fortunes on financial infrastructure developed to serve the crusading enterprise. Every time you use a credit card, wire money internationally, or read a corporate balance sheet, you are using tools whose direct ancestors were forged in the desperate financial laboratories of the medieval Holy Land. The fall of Acre in 1291 ended the Western military presence in the Levant, but the financial systems did not vanish. They found new purposes, and the Templars, whose network had grown so powerful that multiple European kings owed them enormous sums, discovered the darkest lesson of medieval finance. King Philip IV of France was deeply in debt to the Templar order. In 1307, he resolved that debt not by paying it, but by destroying his creditor. The coordinated arrest, systematic torture, and eventual execution of the Templar leadership was wrapped in charges of heresy and dark ritual, but strip away the theater and what remains is a financial crime committed by a sovereign debtor against his most powerful creditor. The confiscated Templar assets were nominally transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, but a large portion quietly disappeared into the French royal treasury. The message sent to every financial institution in Europe was chilling and unmistakable. No matter how wealthy, how connected, or how seemingly indispensable you become, the sovereign state can annihilate you if it owes you enough money and sees no other way to settle the account. That lesson reverberated for centuries. It shaped how banking families structured their relationships with royal powers. It taught financiers to diversify their political risks, to never let a single sovereign become simultaneously their largest client and their greatest threat. The Templars had made themselves too essential to one kingdom and too rich for that kingdom to tolerate. Their destruction was not an act of religious purification. It was a balance sheet adjustment enforced by armed men. The Crusades lasted 200 years, cost millions of lives, and reshaped the political and economic landscape of 3 continents. And the deepest irony of the entire saga is that the men who marched east to save their immortal souls ended up inventing the very tools of commerce, credit, and capital that would build the most relentlessly materialistic civilization in human history. Logistics was never the secondary concern. Logistics was always the primary concern. The speeches, the prayers, the soaring banners, those were decoration layered over a structure built from supply chains, credit arrangements, and the unglamorous daily work of moving resources from where they existed to where they were desperately needed. The next time you hear someone describe a great historical event purely in terms of heroes and courage and belief, ask one deceptively simple question: who paid for it? Where did the money come from? Who built the ships? Who lent the gold? And what did they demand in return? Because when you follow the money, you always find a story that is messier, more human, more morally complex, and more honest than the polished version. If you know someone who thinks about history this way, someone who wants to understand, not just what happened, but how it was possible, share this with them. And tell me in the comments which part of this financial story surprised you most, or which angle you want explored next, because your answers genuinely shape what Stay Financial Historian investigates from here. The men who walked toward Jerusalem believed they were running towards salvation and away from sin. What they could not see, what none of us can ever fully see, is that the thing you are desperately running toward, and the thing you are desperately running from sometimes turn out to be the same thing, just seen from different angles across the vast and unforgiving arc of time.